As someone who has been playing the Battlefront games since launch, it is always wild to me to see just how much the perspective of the franchise has changed among various groups of people throughout the various milestones and years of their existence. The game is particularly popular right now, and seemingly everyone in the community is overjoyed with this news. Well, I wouldn't say like overjoyed per se, but rather excitedly optimistic, especially in regards of what this could mean for the future of the franchise. Contrast that with the early days, no, not just the launch of Battlefront 2, but the days, maybe weeks, hell, even years before DICE's first reboot of the franchise, and you'll see a very different tune being sung. The main catalyst for this was the popularity of Battlefront 2 2005 for the various platforms of the time. Exceedingly popular, and as the last entrance into the series until 2015, it was elevated to this unreasonable standard of what a Star Wars FPS should look like. The general advocacy for this stance lay on a spectrum of reasons as to why it was the premier game to build the Battlefront franchise on. On one end of the spectrum was vague and nebulous ideas to somehow recapture childhood memories with ill-defined ideals of gameplay and design philosophies that were never defined beyond something that will make it feel like this again. On the other side was advocacy for design principles that were somewhat behind even in 2005 to be implemented into a game for the modern era. Needless to say, but back in 2015, the voices of the masses that believed the new entry into the franchise was not going to be the Battlefront they imagined it to be, rebutted with some reasoning that lay somewhere on that spectrum. You can see this with popular online personalities of the time echoing these sentiments, and all harkening back to this mystified version of a perfect Battlefront game. They would do this with vague platitudes and steering of legitimate criticisms into hyperbolic misrepresentations of the design of both DICE's and Pandemic's game. Now, players would very much welcome a new entry into the franchise that is very similar to the game we have now, if not welcome a revitalization of the current game. I personally am very happy around the changing perspectives, and while I do offer a tremendous amount of credit to DICE for the turnaround, I believe that time was also a huge factor in this development. Okay, so back in 2015, people who played 2005's Battlefront when they were around 10 years old would have been around 20 years of age, the age that represents the most active demographic for creating gaming content online. So, when they believed the Battlefront reboot was not up to par, they were the largest voices connecting the two games. It's not like DICE didn't invite those comparisons in or anything. It was a reboot after all. And that meant targeting people who would have played 2005s all those years ago and helped to develop the reputation for the franchise. The audience, both for the game and content around the game, would have been in a similar demographic as the loudest content creators of the time, with the content audience skewing a bit older and the game audience skewing a bit younger, despite the connections between the two. Younger players were guaranteed to play it with the new movies being released and all, but the main focus still remained on capturing fans of the original and maybe helping younger fans create similar memories with 2015's Battlefront. Looking back with hindsight, we can see the world has become more vitriolic over the years and was definitely first reflected in gaming content of this era. More explosive reactions started to become more popular around that time, and this started affecting the gaming scene, as we can see now with how oversaturated that style is now on YouTube. So back in 2015, the more you could slam aggressively on a game, the more likely it was your stuff was going to stand out and you could grab attention. This was coupled by an audience already being familiar with why they liked 2005's Battlefront, so there was no reason to really explain why 2015 was terrible, as many were just accepted with their own reasoning, especially around the endless EA bad sentiment of the time. However, it has been around 5 years since that point, and a lot has changed. Angry content creators have moved on. No longer are they consumed with games of their childhood, as they move ever more into adulthood, where nuance is required to move forward. The world became a lot more divided, but that does mean people are more wary of simply trusting what they seem to agree with at first and require deeper understanding, especially when it comes to such vitriolic statements. Loudly shouting on how video game companies are bad in very hyper-specific ways has somehow become an oversaturated genre and thus struggles to get much attention on a wider stage these days. More nuanced, high quality and thoughtful pieces on video game design and other topics that take into consideration studies, expert opinions and rigorous fact-checking have become increasingly popular online. Seeing all of this, thoughtful creators willing to engage in more hopeful topics relating to the Battlefront games have emerged and have engaged in more thoughtful content compared to the content found around 5 years ago. Similarly, the audience has moved on as well. 5 years seems to be enough years to shake off their hopes for a revival as they too move on to the more nuanced world of adulthood. Screeching is less likely from an older crowd, and a more reflective approach is taken in discussing these games, and that's if these games are discussed among them at all. Younger fans will not possess as much attachment to the older titles, as they were most likely too young to develop deep memories around the 2005 game, and would have rather formed it around a game released around 5 years later than that. Any other attachments they might have to the older Battlefront games would most likely be manufactured by the earlier mentioned crowd. However, they appeal to nostalgia that would have been presented in the content of a younger crowd consumed obviously would not have such a strong effect. The younger crowd would and has started consuming and creating content related to their nostalgia and their games that are in that category. If they do have an attachment to the Battlefront franchise, it's to the newer games, and while they are certainly capable of recognizing the good ideas the originals implemented, they won't be unjustifiable or vitriolic to the current games when discussing the current state of affairs. While I strongly believe the commitment DICE and EA had to turning this game around contributed heavily to the change in the general perspective, I am also acutely aware the reputation has improved because of the maturing of the initial audience, of the then future audience, of the content creators, the environment for perspective creators, as well as the platform for the content, and the game creations themselves. Also, so many more games are more easily accessible now more than ever, what with subscription services for multiplayer coming with free games, game streaming services, and more free games available through a multitude of different services than ever before. The landscape for the industry is changing, and is not so conducive to immense dogpiling in the name of some dubious nostalgia.